Hello and welcome to today's painting demonstration. I'm going to show you how to paint this Fall in the Mountains scene and explain my process along the way. The reference for this painting is going to be in my art community Discord, and the links for that are in the description below. So I started out with a pretty detailed sketch, and some of this was me trying to figure out a composition. I did a couple thumbnails, I rearranged things many times. I wanted to be able to give each layer of forest enough space to be appreciated, but I also needed the transition to be not so abrupt, not choppy. So there's going to be some soft blending as you come forward. The journey that I want your eye to take is going to be down this path, up this misty space between these large evergreen trees, and then up into the light side of the clouds. So I'm going to make sure to make the clouds darker in the corner, keeping you inside the painting, but I think that this composition is going to be quite lovely. So I am going to get started with a burnt sienna, a really warm underpainting. I'm going to start with the darker values, which is going to be the trees. Now, this doesn't have to be right on the money as far as coverage. You don't need to start with such a detailed sketch, but sometimes I get carried away because I do feel like the drawing step is fun. And if I'm thinking about things or just working something out in my head, if I don't feel like the values are going to display the composition quite right, then I will just keep on drawing until I feel completely happy with it. I do want to make sure that this paint layer is kept pretty thin. And right now the paint has pretty much no water in it whatsoever. But that's going to change when I go a little bit lighter in value, which will be right now. So that's my first little amount of water. And without adding any more paint to the brush, I am going over the more medium value areas. Using the side of a large filbert here. Trying to make sure there aren't a whole lot of square abrupt edges. Now I'm working my way into the background mountains. And it's only going to be lighter from there to the distant mountains and then the corner of the sky. I feel like having this much planning really sets you up for success. There's less questions that you make along your painting process, and that leaves you able to make other decisions, like your brush work and the colors. And there's so much more to think about even after you get the underpainting done, that at least you don't have to worry about adjusting your composition while you're also working on concentrating on your brush work. Now I'm going to have most of that paint off my brush for the lightest values, which is those trunks and the horizon of the sky. Okay, that looks good, and I am digging it already. And if you like it when you're just at the value step where your values are in and your drawing is done and it's looking good already, then it's just easier to build up from that. Got a little bit of puddling water that I'm just gonna whisk away so that this dries a little bit faster. I do want to start in the sky. Going with a back to front type technique. Now I'm going to grab the smaller filbert for the next step, but first we need to mix some colors. So the sky is going to be having some storm clouds, but also there's going to be some warmth and light coming off of this mountain line right there. But I am going to need to mix some gray with some dark value, so actually I should probably start with that. Burnt sienna and ultramarine blue is the colors that I'm going to use for the darkest value of our painting, and most all of the paintings that I do here in acrylic. You just want to mix those two together until you get something that's right in between the warm and the cold. And you can shift back and forth if you want a warm darkest value or a colder darkest value based on how much of each of these paints you're going to add together, but that is pretty darn dark. Now, in order to check that, you can always tint it, which is adding some titanium white to see exactly how neutral or how cool you are. I'm thinking this one's pretty close to neutral. That's looking pretty good. And I'm just going to add a little bit of cerulean blue. And that'll be our storm clouds, and I'll just be adding some white to that. To get the variation. So now we have a warm medium gray and a cool medium gray branching off of our darkest value there. And I'll just be adding a little bit more yellow for the evergreen trees, keep those pretty neutral. I don't want to add a whole lot of green to this composition. We're just going to be focusing on lots of warm oranges and yellows, going up to some like cool, subtle gray blues, and then the sky will just have a touch of warmth, not as much as in the reference photo. In fact, most everything is different from the reference. So, as you will notice, coming forward. I think we're good on mixing. I think that's going to be fine. I'll just set the palette knife aside. Reclaim the filbert. I am going to start on that horizon line, and I'm just going to drag with the cleanest white. Drag that along the horizon line, and I'm going to let some of the warmth from the underpainting show through. And then as I come away from that mountain line, I'm going to add a little bit of gray and just keep on blending away from it. The nice thing about these cloudy sky gradients is you can be pretty messy with your brushwork and it will look cloudy. Maybe even the messier the better. A little darker coming up this mountaintop, leading us into that dark corner. The dark storm clouds, cumulonimbus, which is going to help obscure that mountain line coming off of the page. Gonna help keep our eye inside of the scene. That was a little bit dark up there. I'm gonna grab some white and do a good job blending that. Grabbing a little bit more titanium white and I'm dragging it over that dark gray. Just a couple little wispies going over those gray clouds. And I feel like we're about good there. Now I have the distant mountains. You're going to be using that same blue-gray, maybe just a hint more blue in it. But I mean just a little bit. They're going to be lighter than the darkest storm cloud. So the light is coming from this area way back there. And I think our time is done with this filbert brush, at least for now. We might use it again for the foreground, bushes and stuff like that. For now, that gets put aside. I'm going to switch over to my 1/2 inch flat. And go back to that mountain face. Okay, now picking up some darker color. I'm using some rough blending to convey some mountain texture. And getting a little bit darker as I get towards the edge. All right, now for the other side. going to make sure there's enough variation in this mountain line with little dips and little tiny crags sticking up out of it. I don't want it to be like a very simple line. The simple line makes your eye kind of race to the bottom of it to try to get to something more interesting. I want to make sure that there is enough texture on there, but it has to be very low contrast, subtle blending here. As the mountain goes towards this little distant tree line, I'm going to lighten up the color just a bit, just so that I can keep that tree line soft but still readable. And towards the middle here, I'm going to go lighter. And that light gray blue color is going to go all the way down in between these pine trees. Okay, so go back to the medium gray. I think I'm going to lighten it up just a little bit, and that distant tree line, it is okay if it disappears in and out of the mountain. That's totally fine. It's just going to be a subtle texture. Part of the reason why we are working from back to front is because there are so many layers, and it is going to be easier to get the details and shapes that we want if we're just able to cover instead of being so careful painting around everything. But there will be some negative painting at the end. I will be cutting out some shapes because all of our colors will still be present on the palette. This is not going to be too big of a deal. Ooh, I didn't quite like that little shape, so I'm kind of being fussy about it and going back and found my second dog hair of the painting. There we go. That's a lot better. I'm going to flip over to the other side, but I kind of want to start from this side first and work my way progressively lighter. I think this blue-gray is going to look really nice next to the fall tree foliage. It'll be a little bit lighter as we go down into the lower branches of the trees. Just picking up some white paint to do that. See, there's a lot to keep track of. So it is nice to have that background and drawing to guide myself through the rest of this. A little bit darker there. And there's just little tiny touches of warmth popping through on the underpainting. Right, that's looking pretty lovely. Something I see right there that I want to put some white into the sky just while I'm thinking about it. It's just adding a little bit more white over those gray cloud shapes. Add some interest and some variation. All right, I might not even have to go back up to the sky since I took some time to touch it up right there. Okay, now we're in the evergreen layer. Evergreen layer, want that to be pretty dark. That's going to be our darkest value. And so I'm going to take what we have mixed and add some cadmium yellow light to it. That was clearly too much yellow, but I'm going to keep on adding the dark value and then just a little bit of cerulean blue to kind of evergreen that up a bit. It's all right if it stays pretty muted. I'm dragging some burnt sienna over now to get that earthy. There we go. I think that right there is what we want. Now, I'm gonna paint in that whole tree layer. Just going to alternate a lot of my brushwork to give variation. This is a layer of trees, but I am going to put some branchless deciduous trees in front of it, as if there weren't enough layers of trees as it is. Just add one more for good measure. Okay, now I gotta slow down my brush a little bit to detail out these trees. I'm going to be using the sharp edge and the wide edge of my brush to do this. And I'll start over here on the side, so this is, I'm going to work my way up to the top of the tree and then just take the very edge, get the little dainty parts. I'm going to make sure to leave lots of air. When you're positive painting trees, sometimes there's a tendency to kind of fill in too much, and then where are the birds gonna fly? You want to make sure that your spacing between your pine trees is not equal. Nothing looks stranger than a bunch of pine trees that are spaced out exactly the same amount. And sometimes you won't even realize it's happening until you're pretty much done. I've done it. It can happen. If you can help it, also, making your pine trees not too symmetrical from left side to right side also helps your tree shapes become more interesting. But as you are hanging out in a pine tree forest, you will notice that a lot of them are pretty darn symmetrical, so I'm pulling more dark value into this green to give myself some variation. Just a little bit. Not a lot. Just enough to make it interesting to your eye. I'm also going to be adding some negative shapes into these trees towards the end of our painting process. Not a crazy amount though. So these details are getting pretty small. This painting surface is only 6 by 6 inches. All right, evergreen tree layer is complete. I'm going to put some blue grays into that little trail using horizontal brush strokes, and I'm still on the flat. I'm going to drag some of that gray up on these little rocks that I have marked out. And then this is just some of that warm gray that we had from earlier. Now the orange. Got cadmium red medium here and cadmium yellow light. I'm going to get a little bit more yellow orange towards the inside edge of this tree. But I'm going to go a little bit darker as we go down. Extending out some little leaf shapes. or interest, not everywhere, just a couple. And let the viewer's eye fill that in. So since we're moving towards darker orange on the left side of the tree, what we can do is we can add those same echoed leaf shapes of the orange into the area that is more yellow. That'll give our tree a little bit more dimension. Going back down to that medium orange, and I'm coming down to the ground. The bushes on the ground, I'm going to give them a real quick textured coat, moving from the dark orange to the medium to the light and just blending that with brush strokes that kind of imply bushes from the ground. So you'll just want to make sure that those are kind of coming down or radiating up from the ground, just vaguely. They don't have to be attached to the ground. It's a little much on the red. Red is a very powerful color. You want to save that for special occasions. Now I'm dragging some of that orange down to the side of the trail, and I'm going to darken that up on the corner. Grabbed a little bit of burnt sienna to do that. So the way you want your brush strokes to be angled, I've heard it explained as if it were raining and water was coming down the surface of this object, whatever it is, whether it be a tree or the ground or what have you, your brush wants to go in the direction of the water would be flowing. And that's a good way to remember it when you're feeling clumsy with how you're placing things. That is something to try out for sure. I haven't run into anything that would make that untrue yet. Doesn't mean there isn't a situation where that would be untrue. Darkening up the corner of our tree here to keep your eye inside the frame. I'm also adding a little bit of burnt sienna to kind of earth tone that thing down. Orange is a very powerful color. And I'm just dragging that paint around so that I have some transparent transitions as well. Okay, so now this area, yellows and oranges, big, vague ground bush shrubbery shapes. right, now some touches of yellow to give a couple little plants some definition. The plant edges are more happening in your imagination. Definitely don't have to paint or detail out a specific plant unless it's something that is in the foreground. Even then, it should have some edges that are a little bit vague. I also don't want this to become so choppy that it grabs all of the attention. Now I got this foreground bush, has a little bit more yellow on it. Maybe I'll add more yellow to the tips. And then of course it's going to come down. In value as we get closer to the corner of the painting. I'll add some branches for this one too. Then I'm going to go with burnt sienna for the corner. Bigger the bush, the bigger the brush strokes. Okay, there we are. Now, what I'm going to do next is switch to the liner. I have a number 1 liner that I'm going to be using for these little branches that are in the midground. Now, the evergreen tree layer is totally dry now, and I'm going to use the medium gray. I'm grabbing the warmer gray, but I'm not sure if this makes any difference. Make sure there's like 50-50 water to paint ratio. You need to make sure that those bristles are workable. I'm also twirling my paintbrush in the palette and then making sure that it has a nice sharp edge. And this is because I personally am very particular about my branch work. You don't have to be. These are in the distance, so they're not main character trees. But what I am going to do is I don't need to connect them to the ground, and this will save you a lot of effort. You do not need to connect them to the ground. You do need to make sure your hand stays out of that yellow paint on the right side of your painting, but here we go. Sometimes this is scary. If you are scared, you can test it out on a piece of paper. If you want the paint to become more transparent, you can add a little bit more water. As it dries, it will blend into the previous layer, whatever color it may be. But the most important takeaway here is that the branches do not need to connect. Between that and making sure that your tree spacing is not the same on every tree, I think you're gonna do great. I'm going to do a couple of these on the right side of that focal point right there. That would be our primary focal point. That channel of lit fog going into the distance. I've used that trick before. I will use it again. It's very important to move your viewer to the background, to the distant plane of your painting. Gives you a nice long journey for your eye to take. Okay, now while you have your liner out, you're gonna do the branch work for these foreground trees. I'm gonna pick up a darker value. Not all the way dark though. Leave a little bit of gray in there. Maybe this is like a value 7. Something like that. Now, the dark side of the trees is going to be the left side because our light source is coming from about center. Again, the branches do not need to all be connected. The story is that there is foliage going in and out of them, so it's actually better if they are broken up. You don't want to look like your branches were pasted on top of all of your leaves. You can also add more leaves after doing the branches if you felt like you went a little hard. Okay, now down the left side of this other friend tree, and that's before we're going to pick a much lighter gray, the warm gray, and then we're going to go up the middle of that trunk. You can even touch the right side of that trunk, that's totally fine. You can touch a little bit of this gray paint onto some of the thicker branches. Okay, and that will do. Now, while that's still fresh, still wet, still workable, I'm gonna grab some white. It doesn't have to be the cleanest white. I'm gonna actually put a little bit of light gray in there just because I can always go whiter, and that's fine. Now, using horizontal brush strokes, and the flat brush doesn't necessarily need to be 100% level to the painting surface. And towards the right side of the trunk, I'm just gonna do some varying horizontal brush strokes. It's gonna give this nice bark texture. Can overlap onto that darker side of the tree just a hair. Now I'm grabbing a little bit whiter white and just going on that very rightmost edge. Make sure the intervals of your bark mark, are varied and not pattern-like. Okay, that's good. I like that. I like that texture. I like that it gets darker going up into the foliage. I might pull a couple little yellow leaves in those trees. I'm gonna wait for that to dry before adding any negative shapes. I do want to add some negative shapes to that mass of trees. I think right now it feels very pasted on, but now that we have most of our elements in, I'm gonna do some minor adjustments and some negative shapes. So I'm grabbing that light gray and I'm gonna highlight the middle of our path. Gives us some nice texture to that. I'm gonna highlight those little very, very subtle rock shapes that are in there. Oh, and you know what? You caught me. I totally forgot the branches that are in this shrubbery over here. Dark gray, and this is very important, I'm not going to extend these branches to the end of the painting. Now after that dries, I might drag a couple more little leaf shapes over those because they're not my favorite branches that I've ever painted, but I also don't feel like it's a major issue. So the negative shapes that I'm going to put on our evergreen trees are oh so small. I'm grabbing the #1 point brush, put some water in it, and I am pulling those bristles to a point. Very tiny point, and I'm going to grab that light cool gray and just a couple little details. They're going to be more towards the middle of the composition, so that's where we want most of our interest. This is a good time to fix any wonky shapes that you aren't in love with. Just keep in mind that the wonky shapes that are kind of coming away from the focal point they just don't matter as much. They don't have as much weight, hopefully. Unless it's visually distracting. That treetop has a little funny pizzazz to it, but I think it's okay. We're gonna leave it. More details coming down that focal point. And it's just going to throw you into the bushes right there. Now the negative shapes for these trees here, foreground trees. That is the same cool gray. Now I'm going to be really mindful of where I put these. I like doing them in small groups of 3s and 5s usually. And just makes them look more together. Also make sure that you're not repeating shapes that are in groups. Maybe you have a small, a medium, and a large that are friends that are right next to each other, and then you could change the angles. And maybe tint them just a little bit differently, and that will give you more of a stained glass look. I think one more big one that's a little bit darker. Great. Another thing I'm noticing right now is I want to bring a little bit of this grass and bushes and shrubs and all this mess kind of like overlapping onto the tree a bit. Just to set it in the scene a little bit more, instead of it looking so pasted on top. I'm using my point brush. I'm doing it in a way where it is pretty darn perpendicular to the thing I'm painting on, and that will help give me a nice organic shape. A couple more of these on the right side to make them seem like they belong, and then I will brush a couple of them onto this foreground bush, and that'll help out what I am almost considering to be a little bit of wonky branches. Highlight that path a little bit more. Every time I highlight the path, it's just a little bit smaller, a little bit smaller. A little bit smaller and a little bit more on that right edge. And we are about done. I do want to make this part of the mountain just a little bit darker. So now that it's dried completely, I want it to pop out just a little bit more from the sky than it does right now in this moment, before it transitions into that lighter color. And I'm just gonna blend that. integrating that texture and color into this mountain. Now that dark side of it, I'm not as bothered by it showing. A little bit more white, a little bit more white. And just a little bit of white negative shapes coming down these background trees. It's a very subtle effect. Okay, now we're reflecting, like, do we add anything else? I'm gonna add a little bit of burnt sienna with, I have water on my brush, and it's just to add a little bit of warmth down towards the bottom of that evergreen tree layer. And that's to imply all of this foreground fall brush continues back into the distance, which is what would make sense. Gives us another color gradient, another transition, another thing to look at, but it's subtle and doesn't pull the eye too much. Okay, so now I think that does it. That's a wrap. I'm pretty happy with that. It's another fall scene that I hope can grace your shelves if you have a chance to try it out. There's a lot of leeway here, a lot of different things you can do with the different layers, but when you break it down and make yourself a nice clear plan, then it becomes less scary. So good luck to you, and until next Wednesday for another painting tutorial, a fall festive scene, happy painting.